In the U.S. Senate, marble floors don't silence injustice, they echo it. On a Tuesday afternoon during what should have been a routine budget debate, a sentence dropped like a weight in water. Many homeless people simply don't want to work, especially in black communities. The words came from Senator Josh Hawley, calm and deliberate. Not a slip, a signal. It was more than ignorance. It was a strategy, a line crafted to sound like fiscal concern, but built on a scaffold of racial prejudice. It was the kind of message that lets the powerful justify neglect, that blames the victims, not the system. And it wasn't the first time someone tried to rewrite suffering into laziness. But this time someone was listening. Jasmine Crockett sat silent, watching, recording, remembering. Not for revenge, but for the reckoning she knew would come. Before we get too deep, tap like and subscribe if stories like this keep you up thinking. And if you're watching right now, drop your state and the time you're tuning in. We want to know who's still awake with us. Dim the lights, turn down the world. This is where the silence breaks. The chamber didn't gasp. No one shouted. No gavel slammed. No dramatic objection echoed through the marble halls. What came after Hawley's words was far more telling. Silence. A cold, uneasy stillness that settled like fog. Across the chamber floor, staffers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few turned their heads slowly, not in protest, but in disbelief. One reporter, halfway through a sip of coffee, froze mid-motion, as if time itself had paused to ask, did he just say that? And yet, no one moved to challenge it. That was the part that struck Jasmine Crockett hardest. It wasn't just that Josh Hawley had said something cruel. It was that so many around him, colleagues in polished suits, aides with Ivy League resumes, lobbyists in tailored coats, either nodded in quiet agreement or did nothing at all. There were no murmurs of dissent, no procedural interruptions, no visible discomfort, only the quiet affirmation of indifference. Josh Hawley, smug in his tailored blue suit, leaned back with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he'd said what many were already thinking, but didn't dare say aloud. He wasn't worried about backlash. He was testing the room, and what he got in return wasn't an outrage. It was permission. Permission to carry on. He continued speaking, his voice smooth and sure. Our nation is in a fiscal freefall because we've confused compassion with codependency, he said. We throw billions into entitlement programs with little accountability. And what do we get in return? Generational poverty, crime, dependency. He paused carefully, especially in the inner cities. The phrase landed with precision, not too direct to trigger formal reprimand, but not subtle enough to go unnoticed. It was a textbook dog whistle, one that didn't need to be explained, one that had been used, recycled, and repackaged for decades by those who knew how to weaponize policy against the poor, especially the black poor. The truth is, he continued, some folks don't want help. They want handouts. In the gallery, a group of conservative donors whispered among themselves, half smiling. One of them, an older white man in a navy pinstripe suit, nodded approvingly, as if Hawley had finally said what needed to be said. The camera panned to Senator Whitaker from Arkansas, who gave a faint smirk, tapping his pen. Another, Senator Klein from Utah, checked his phone without a word. Not one glance toward Jasmine. Not one sign of discomfort. Jasmine Crockett sat alone near the edge of the chamber. Unmoving, not even blinking. She didn't scribble notes. She didn't shake her head. She just watched. And she remembered. Because that's what it means to be the only one in the room who knows what the room doesn't want to admit. She saw the way Hawley's eyes scanned the chamber, not for opposition, but for allies. And she saw who looked away. They knew better. But they feared rocking the boat more than they feared what was being said. To them, politics was a game of leverage. But to Jasmine, it was about life. Real ones that looked like her father, her cousins, her neighbors. Men and women who didn't need speeches. They needed housing. They needed a policy that didn't treat their pain like a political liability. But in this room, their stories were being reduced to talking points. And Jasmine knew if she raised her voice now, if she confronted him here and now, They would paint her as emotional, angry, reactionary. The angry black woman trope would surface before her words even landed. She wasn't going to play into that. No, she was going to do something far more dangerous. She was going to listen. And when the time was right, she would respond. Not with rage, but with receipts. She reached slowly into her folder and began flipping through pages. Her hand paused on a report. HUD's 2024 point-in-time homelessness data, the most recent one. She knew what it said. Black Americans represented 13% of the U.S. population and over 40% of the homeless population. Not because they didn't want to work, because the system wasn't built to hold them up, only to hold them back. Jasmine's fingers traced the printed graphs as if they were scars. She wasn't going to yell. She was going to cut through. Across the room, Hawley moved to sit, a satisfied smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth. He thought he'd scored points, that he'd shifted the debate. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the silence in the chamber wasn't weakness. It was the storm preparing itself. And Jasmine Crockett, she was the lightning waiting in its heart. Hawley adjusted his tie, stood confidently behind the Senate lectern, and leaned forward as if he were about to share an uncomfortable truth the country had been too afraid to say out loud. He wasn't done. Let's talk plainly, he said. We're facing a national crisis, not just in our budget, but in our culture. We've created a class of dependency, a culture of entitlement. The word culture hung in the air like smoke. He didn't say black. He didn't need to. And no amount of federal spending can fix a mindset that refuses to take responsibility. From the gallery, a few nods of agreement. The camera zoomed in. His voice was steady, his tone almost academic. But underneath it was something far older than economic theory, something uglier. I've seen the numbers, Hawley continued, flipping through a binder more for effect than necessity. We're pouring billions into housing vouchers, food programs, emergency shelters, and yet, year after year, the same neighborhoods, the same inner-city blocks show no improvement. Ask yourself why. That phrase again, inner city. It sounded neutral, but for generations it had been political shorthand, a way to say black without saying black, a way to talk about poverty as pathology, not policy failure. Jasmine knew the script. She'd heard it since law school, since her days as a public defender in Dallas. But here, on the Senate floor, it was being read aloud as if it were the truth. You give them everything, Hawley said, gesturing vaguely, and still they demand more. At what point do we stop enabling and start expecting? He used they like a scalpel, clean, sharp, and surgical. The American dream is about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. My father did it. My grandfather did it. So tell me, why is it that some people just won't? That line landed like a stone. Jasmine blinked slowly. Bootstraps. The word itself had become a myth, an American bedtime story for the privileged. One that erased redlining, generational poverty, incarceration, education gaps, and systemic racism with a single phrase. Just work harder. But Hawley was building his narrative, brick by brick, prejudice wrapped in policy. He flipped another page, now turning his attention to federal housing. The average stay in subsidized housing is over 5 years, he said. We're not helping people transition. We're funding lifestyles. We're turning the taxpayer into a lifelong sponsor of irresponsibility. Gasps nearly rose, but were caught in throats. Then the line that made Jasmine's fingers clench, just barely. I met a woman in St. Louis, Hawley said. Had 5 kids by 3 different fathers, lived in government housing her whole life. And when I asked her what her plan was, she said, Why should I work? Uncle Sam pays better than McDonald's. He smiled faintly, as if sharing an anecdote from the campaign trail. The way people laugh about potholes and bad diner coffee. We're not talking about hard-working Americans falling on hard times, he clarified. We're talking about a welfare queen mentality that's been passed down like inheritance. There it was, welfare queen, a term born in the Reagan era used to caricature poor black mothers as manipulative and lazy, a label that had ruined lives and poisoned public perception for decades. And now it had found its way back, dressed up in a tailored suit, delivered on the Senate floor. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she quietly reached for her notepad. She knew what he was doing. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was reframing, turning desperation into criminality, turning systemic failures into personal defects, making poverty a punchline. Let's be clear, Hawley went on. This isn't about race. This is about culture, accountability, choices. We cannot continue throwing money at people who refuse to lift themselves up. But everything in his delivery said otherwise. His examples weren't drawn from rural Appalachia or laid-off factory towns in Missouri. No, his targets were urban, his language coded, his disdain is specific. And now he looked toward Jasmine, just briefly. A glance, a challenge. He was daring her to speak because he wanted her to erupt, to play the role they'd written for her, the angry black woman, the radicals. The activist is out of place in a room for serious people. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't rise. She didn't even blink. Because she knew something Hawley didn't. He had just made his mistake. He thought he'd delivered a winning blow, but all he'd done was hand her the rope, with his own words as the knot. She didn't need to shout. She was going to bury him, in fact. And when she did, he wouldn't just be wrong, he'd be exposed. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak. Not when the room tilted with tension. Not when the murmurs began. Not even when the word welfare queen was spoken on the Senate floor with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never missed a meal. She didn't blink. Because when you're black and a woman and holding public office, silence can be sharper than a scream. She sat still, hands folded neatly in front of her, like a chess master 2 moves ahead. Her eyes didn't leave the dais. She was watching. Not Hawley's mouth, but his hands. The shift in his posture, the way he clutched his binder tighter when he said bootstraps, the slight tremor when he said them. He was smug, but he was also scared. And Jasmine had seen that before, in prosecutors who lost control of their case, in judges who knew their rulings couldn't stand under daylight. She reached for her pen. No sudden movement, just grace, intentionality. She scribbled 4 words in the margins of her notes. HUD, BLS, VA 20 poem. Because rebuttal would not come in sound bites. It would come in facts, in receipts, in the quiet documentation of truth. She pulled the official transcript closer, highlighting his words as they appeared in real time from the stenographer feed. That was her legal mind at work, securing evidence, not emotions. She circled the phrase welfare queen mentality and underlined inner cities. This wasn't an insult, she thought, it was a pattern. And Jasmine had spent her whole life recognizing patterns the world told her to ignore. She remembered sitting in courtrooms as a young defense attorney in Dallas, watching judges raise bail impossibly high for black teens caught with less than an ounce of marijuana, while white teens from Highland Park walked free with community service. She remembered walking through food deserts in South Oak Cliff, where groceries were a 40-minute bus ride away, but liquor stores dotted every corner. She remembered when her own cousin, a Navy vet, came home with PTSD, found no support, and ended up sleeping in a borrowed car. Not because he was lazy, because the VA had a backlog, because affordable housing was a myth, because Texas politics didn't care. And now, sitting in the highest chamber of the land, she was hearing the same lie, spoken more elegantly perhaps, but laced with the same poison. They don't want help. They choose poverty. We've done enough. She inhaled deeply, exhaled slower. That breath wasn't just air, it was resistance. Because Jasmine knew exactly what Hawley was trying to do. Bait her. He wanted her to react, to interrupt, to get angry on record so he could pivot to being the reasonable statesman under attack. But she wasn't there to perform rage. She was there to perform surgery. Instead of speaking, she reached into her folder and pulled out a document Hawley hoped no one would mention. The 34 HUD point-in-time count report. It was 46 pages. Dry to most, but to Jasmine it was dynamite. She flipped to page 12, charting racial disparities in homelessness. It showed black Americans made up 13% of the U.S. population, but 41% of the homeless population. She turned to the footnotes where the report explicitly cited systemic barriers to employment, historic housing discrimination, and limited access to health care as primary drivers. She marked it. Then came the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, unemployment rates by race, educational background, and geography. She flipped to the veteran section. African American veterans had the highest rates of post-service unemployment, nearly double that of white counterparts. Then she reached for a file few in the room had ever cared to read. Testimony from the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, March 2024. Inside was a first-hand account from a former Army sergeant, now unhoused, a black man from St. Louis. He didn't want handouts. He wanted a job, therapy, a roof. He had served 2 tours in Iraq. He now served time in invisibility. She placed a sticky note on his story. Jasmine wasn't building a response. She was building a case, and when it came, it wouldn't be a clapback. It would be a demolition. Across the room, Hawley leaned back, watching her with that smug, calculated glance of a man who thought he'd caught her off guard. He didn't realize the storm had already begun. Not with thunder, but with paper, with policy, with truth. Cameras panned, waiting for Jasmine to erupt. Instead, she turned a page, and at that moment, America didn't hear shouting. They heard the sound of someone getting ready to dismantle a lie. The moment came not with a bang, but with a simple phrase. "Mr. President, may I have the floor?" The presiding officer nodded without hesitation. The chamber turned. Jasmine Crockett rose. No rush, no raised voice, just a calm, deliberate presence. And in that stillness, the weight of what she carried became unmistakable. She stepped toward the mic with a folder in her hand, not full of rhetoric, but of records. Her voice, when it came, was steady, not for performance, but precision. "I've listened carefully to the remarks from my colleague across the aisle. I've highlighted them, in fact, on the official transcript." She raised the paper gently. Terms like welfare queen mentality, references to inner city failure, suggestions that some people simply don't want help. A murmur rippled through the chamber. She continued, "But let me share another name for that kind of language. Historical revisionism. Because when you strip context, erase causality, and assign blame to pain you've never experienced, you're not talking policy. You're upholding a system that was never built for people like me to survive, let alone succeed." She paused, then reached into her folder and held up a different kind of document. This is the 2024 HUD Point-in-Time Homelessness Report. According to it, Black Americans make up 41% of the homeless population, despite being only 13% of the country. That's not a coincidence. That's the consequence. No one moved. She held up another. This one's from the Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics. It shows that Black veterans have nearly twice the rate of post-service unemployment compared to white veterans. Not because they're lazy, because systems fail them when the uniform comes off. And then she changed her tone, softer. "Let me introduce you to someone." She reached for a single sheet of paper. Staff Sergeant Malcolm Reeves, born in East St. Louis, served 2 tours in Iraq, honorably discharged, came home to bills, trauma, in a system that looked the other way. He applied for housing assistance, waitlisted, applied again, waitlisted again, slept in his car for 7 months, then under a bridge, then in a church basement, until it flooded, and that's where he caught pneumonia. Her voice cracked barely, but she didn't pause. He didn't choose that. That wasn't a lifestyle. That wasn't a handout. That was a nation that told him he was a hero, then treated him like debris. And then she turned her gaze directly at Senator Hawley, not in anger, in clarity. "So when you stand here and say some folks don't want help," I'd ask, "have you ever missed meals while waiting on a VA callback? Have you ever walked 6 miles to a shelter just to find a no beds available sign? Have you ever had to decide between insulin and rent?" Her tone stayed calm. Her questions didn't. Because if the answer is no, you don't get to judge the pain you've never lived. The chamber was still, dead still, not a cough, not a page flip. She stepped back from the mic, but not before delivering the pivot. "Let me also remind this chamber that the Fair Housing Act of 1968 codified in Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act, exists because we used to legally deny people housing based on the color of their skin. And the effects of that law's violation for decades still felt today in redline neighborhoods, underfunded schools, and segregated cities that we pretend are accidents of culture, not design. Her words, now weaponized with law, weren't just emotional, they were constitutional. You cannot tell me we've done enough when the systems we built broke people and then blame them for being broken. She sat, no mic drop, no applause, just silence, but it wasn't empty. It was shaken. Cameras swiveled toward Hawley, his face tight, unblinking. He'd been outmaneuvered, not by anger, by evidence, not by volume, by truth. Across the country, C-SPAN viewers leaned in closer. Young interns stopped typing. Congressional aides exchanged glances they didn't know how to interpret. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just responded, she had reframed the debate. This wasn't about lazy people or wasted dollars anymore. It was about dignity, about humanity, and about whether America was ready to admit what it had built and who it had left behind. The silence after Jasmine Crockett's speech was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded someone speak. It was the kind that demanded someone listen. But Josh Hawley couldn't stand it. He leaned forward, shifted in his seat, then rose too fast. His movements lost the grace of strategy. This time they carried something else. Panic dressed as indignation. Let's be very clear, he began, his voice sharper now. I did not say all black people are lazy or homeless. No one had accused him of saying that, yet he said it anyway, and the room noticed. I was referring to a pattern, a culture of dependency that transcends race but is undeniable in certain urban areas. Are we not allowed to name truths anymore? He looked around the chamber, searching for affirmation. Few met his gaze. Fewer still nodded. He kept going, faster now, as if words could bury what Jasmine had just uncovered. What we're seeing, he said, is an over-reliance on government programs that were meant to be temporary, but have become permanent lifelines for people who refuse to take responsibility for their lives. There it was again. Refuse. Not struggle, not denied. Refuse. Hawley slammed his folder closed, harder than necessary. And let's not pretend that anyone who dares to question that reality at sea is suddenly a racist or a bigot. That's the card that always gets played when the facts don't fit the narrative. The race card, he said it, out loud. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't even move. Her composure made his unraveling look worse. Hawley's tone turned defensive, then bitter. You know what? I come from a working-class family. We didn't whine about the system. We worked, we sacrificed. We didn't expect Uncle Sam to show up every time life got hard. He paused as if expecting applause. None came. We didn't cry victim. There it was. Victim. He said it like it was poison. Like it was a role people chose rather than a reality they were forced into. He was spiraling now, too deep into his own fury to find the exit. This country was built by people who didn't need safety nets, he continued. They had grit, they had faith, and yeah, they pulled themselves up by their damn bootstraps. A low, audible intake of breath rippled through the gallery. The words didn't land with the pride he'd hoped for. They sounded dated, hollow, like an echo from a version of America that only existed in textbooks written by men who never went hungry. And then he said it. And maybe, just maybe, if people in the inner cities stopped idolizing thug culture and started acting like they cared about education, about family, about work ethic, we wouldn't be in this mess. A frozen silence. Even his staffers looked down. Jasmine's gaze didn't flinch, but her expression shifted. Not in anger, in recognition, because now the mask had dropped. The dog whistle became a bullhorn. Hawley's next sentence, meant to soften the blow, only made it worse. Look, I'm not saying everyone from those communities is a thug, all right? But let's not pretend there isn't a pattern, a culture. He was sweating now, scrambling to seem reasonable, but his voice betrayed him. We've spent trillions on programs for people who turn around and spit on the flag, glorify crime, and make excuses instead of effort. I'm sorry, but if that offends someone, that's not on me. It was a classic deflection. And yet, the damage was done. C-SPAN cameras had caught every word. Social media interns were already clipping sound bites. One quote in particular spread within minutes. Thug culture, excuses instead of effort, inner city, welfare queens. Hawley, who moments ago had stood tall and composed, now looked small. Cornered, like a man watching the truth inch closer with every word, and realizing he'd just handed it the microphone. Jasmine sat silent through it all, not because she was speechless, because she didn't need to speak again. He had just done it for her. He had revealed exactly what she came to expose, that beneath the surface of policy debates, beneath the numbers and phrases like fiscal responsibility, was a rot, the quiet dehumanization of the poor and the loud contempt for the black. He hadn't just said the quiet part out loud, he'd screamed it, and the country was listening. It started with a single clip, 17 seconds, pulled from C-SPAN's live feed, uploaded to Twitter, no caption, no edits, just raw footage of Senator Josh Hawley saying, maybe if people in the inner city stopped idolizing thug culture. By the end of the first hour, it had over 250,000 views. By hour 3, it was trending on #thugculture, #WeSeeYou, and #Crockett was right. And by midnight, America had split into two camps. One side heard the truth. The other scrambled to bury it. On TikTok, a black veteran named Darnell posted a video. Uniform still in his closet, discharged papers in the background. He looked directly into the camera. I fought in Fallujah. I came back to no job, no home, no mental health support. You call that a culture problem? Nah, man, that's a policy problem. And Jasmine Crockett, she spoke for me. His video hit 3.1 million views in 12 hours. But the counterattack came just as fast. A conservative think tank, the Heritage Liberty Project, published a thread on X, formerly Twitter. Jasmine Crockett is promoting a dangerous narrative of racial victimhood. Senator Hawley was merely pointing out the consequences of failed urban policies. This isn't racism. This is realism. The post was retweeted by 5 sitting senators. But the internet didn't have it, because by then someone had traced the funding for the Heritage Liberty Project, revealing major donations from real estate lobbies, including several that had spent the last decade fighting affordable housing mandates in St. Louis, Dallas, and Detroit. And then it got worse. An internal email leaked from a media consultancy firm hired by Hawley's PAC. The subject line? How to reframe Crockett as divisive. The public saw through it all. They'd watched Hawley say the words. They'd watched Jasmine say the truth. And the more spin they saw, the more they dug in behind her. CNN ran a segment titled, When Policy Becomes Prejudice, What Hawley's Remarks Reveal About Washington. MSNBC did a full-night panel on systemic homelessness in black communities. Trevor Noah, returning for a guest-hosted political special, simply said, you know you messed up when the woman you tried to silence becomes the voice of a nation. Even Fox News couldn't ignore it, though they tried. They aired a segment titled Race Baiting in the Senate and invited a former police chief to defend Hawley's remarks. But the comments section under their YouTube upload told a different story. She didn't bait anyone. He said what he believed, and she called it what it was. Meanwhile, outside the political sphere, the streets began to speak. In Atlanta, protesters gathered with signs reading, bootstraps don't work if you're born barefoot. Veterans deserve housing, not lectures. In Detroit, a mural of Jasmine Crockett went up overnight, painted on the side of an abandoned building that once housed a black family before being lost to foreclosure. The quote beneath her portrait? You don't get to label our pain as policy failure when you've never survived it. The same quote was now pinned on congressional bulletin boards, tattooed on T-shirts, and trending across Reddit threads about racial justice and public policy. But not everyone shifted easily. A coalition of corporate donors threatened to withdraw campaign funds from any member of Congress who sided with Crockett's narrative. Private memos circulated about maintaining discipline in messaging and not letting emotional appeals define the budget conversation. But it was too late, because the people had already decided what the conversation was. And it wasn't about just dollars, it was about dignity. Jasmine Crockett didn't tweet a response. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't need to. Her words had already taken on a life of their own. They'd become a mirror, and America, finally, was being forced to look. Inside the halls of Congress, things began to shift too. A junior Republican staffer leaked that even some conservatives were furious behind closed doors at Hawley for making the party look like it hates poor people. One moderate senator quietly requested a meeting with Jasmine's office. And most telling of all, a closed-door committee meeting to rewrite part of the housing budget, previously seen as untouchable, was suddenly back on the table. The tide wasn't just turning, it was crashing. And Jasmine Crockett, who'd sat silently while the storm brewed, was now its undeniable center. The chamber was still reeling from the shift. News cameras had returned. Every seat was filled. Some senators stared ahead in forced neutrality. Others avoided eye contact completely. Hawley wasn't in the room. His team claimed a scheduling conflict. But everyone knew better. They were waiting for Jasmine. And she knew it. She didn't rush to the podium. She walked slowly, like she wasn't just stepping onto the Senate floor, but stepping into history. Her notes were folded, her hands were bare. She didn't need papers anymore. The truth was in her. She stood behind the mic and adjusted it only once. Then she paused. Not for effect, for clarity. And then she spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but with the kind of unwavering quiet that commanded a room. "You can write budgets all day long," she said, "but if you're doing it with blind eyes and closed hearts, you're not building a nation. You're burying it." There was a shift in the air. She continued, no rehearsed cadence, no soundbite polish. Just a woman speaking what too many had been told to keep inside. What we're witnessing isn't a debate about spending. It's a debate about who we believe deserves to be whole. And then it came. The moment. 15 words. No raising of the voice, no fist pounding. Just the sentence that would rewrite the narrative. "You don't get to label our pain as policy failure when you've never survived it." The chamber frozen. Not from outrage, but from recognition. It was as if the oxygen had shifted, like something sacred had been spoken, and the room didn't quite know what to do with it. The mic stayed open. Jasmine stepped back. She didn't add another word. She didn't need to, because in that one sentence she had undone a generation of talking points, cut through the excuses like glass through paper, and held up a mirror so raw, so intimate, the room didn't look away. It couldn't. Online, it erupted. The clip hit YouTube within 30 minutes. Within 2 hours, it trended #1 on TikTok. "You don't get to label our pain" became the most searched phrase on Twitter that night. Young activists began remixing it over hip-hop beats. Teachers printed it on posters for high school civics classes. Black mothers stitched it into protest banners. Veterans wrote it in chalk outside government buildings. A spoken-word poet in Oakland turned it into an entire piece. An Atlanta church choir sang it in a Sunday service. By morning, CNN had a chyron that read, "Crockett's words sparked national conversation on homelessness, race, and dignity." MSNBC called it the most honest moment on the Senate floor in the last decade. Even Trevor Noah posted it on Instagram with a simple caption, "This is why they fear her." And yet the sentence wasn't just for TV or tweets. It became something deeper. It became a litmus test. Commentators tried to reframe it. She's weaponizing trauma. She's emotional, not policy-oriented. She doesn't understand economics. But every time they tried to explain it away, more people heard it. And every time they heard it, they understood. Because in those 15 words, Jasmine hadn't made a political statement. She'd made a human one. In Baltimore, a young woman who'd grown up in shelters had the words tattooed on her collarbone. In Kansas City, a homeless vet held up a cardboard sign with it written in Sharpie. In the Bronx, it appeared on a billboard, paid for by a crowdfunding campaign that raised $100,000 in Bangladesh. In 48 hours, and in a speech at an HBCU graduation, the dean quoted Jasmine's words before handing out diplomas. "You don't get to label our pain," he said, his voice cracking. "You hear that, class of 25? Your pain is not shameful. It's not a weakness. It's true, and it matters. Jasmine didn't tweet anything. She didn't post a press release. When a reporter asked if she'd planned to say it, she smiled. No, she said. It's just what needed to be said. And that's what made it land. It didn't come from a consultant. It didn't come from a speechwriter. It came from the quiet accumulation of being talked over, dismissed, and told to wait your turn. It came from surviving, and America heard it loud and clear. The quote didn't fade. It didn't get buried under the next news cycle. It grew. In the days after Jasmine Crockett's 15 words pierced the Senate floor, they echoed into places where politics rarely reaches: underpasses, shelters, kitchen tables, hospital beds, and barbershops. This time, the conversation didn't belong to politicians. It belonged to the people. Washington moved because it had to. 2 days later, under mounting public pressure, the Senate Ethics Committee invoked Rule 502, the rarely used protocol for reviewing statements that may reflect discriminatory bias harmful to the dignity of the chamber. Josh Hawley was notified. The official letter didn't name him directly, but the language was unmistakable. The committee has received multiple formal complaints regarding public remarks that may undermine the principles of equal dignity under federal representation. Behind closed doors, Hawley tried to downplay it. Political theater, he called it. But even within his own party, cracks appeared. One GOP senator, an Iraq veteran himself, spoke privately to reporters off the record. I don't agree with how Crockett framed it all, but she wasn't wrong, and the way Hawley handled it was reckless. For the first time in months, bipartisan urgency formed around an unlikely subject: homelessness and veteran care, a resolution born from reckoning. It began as a symbolic gesture, a non-binding resolution drafted by Representative Ayanna Pressley and co-sponsored by Jasmine Crockett, Cory Booker, and surprisingly 3 Republicans from Midwestern states where homelessness among veterans had quietly grown. But what started as symbolism became substance. The resolution passed the House by a wide margin. Title: Affirming the Dignity of All Americans Experiencing Homelessness. Its language: recognizing that poverty is not pathology, that service does not end with a uniform, that policy must reflect lived reality, not inherited bias. And tucked within its body was the exact quote that changed everything. You don't get to label our pain as policy failure when you've never survived it. Funding shifted. So did power. 3 weeks later, an amendment to the federal budget was introduced. Backed by an unlikely coalition, it redirected $400 million in military discretionary funds toward veteran housing infrastructure, mental health crisis units tied to the VA urban reentry job programs for formerly incarcerated veterans. Opponents tried to gut it quietly, but the public wasn't quiet anymore. A digital campaign titled #Budget with Dignity flooded inboxes. Hundreds of thousands of emails, calls, and videos poured in from veterans, nurses, social workers, single mothers, people whose lives had been boiled down to bad decisions for too long. Real lives, real change. In St. Louis, Staff Sergeant Malcolm Reeves, the man Jasmine had named in her speech, was located by a local nonprofit. He hadn't seen the broadcast. But when a volunteer showed him the clip on an old iPhone, he cried. Not because she said his name, but because she remembered his story. Within a week, he was moved into transitional housing. A month later, he was working part-time at a local VA clinic, helping others like him navigate the same system that once forgot him. I didn't think anyone up there knew we existed, he said. Now I know they can't ignore us anymore. Beyond the Beltway, in schools across the country, teachers incorporated Jasmine's speech into social studies curricula. Representation and Rhetoric in Modern Government now included a case study on Crockett's exchange with Hawley. A documentary team from PBS began production on a special titled Crockett, When Silence Spoke Truth. And in communities where politics once felt abstract, far away, inaccessible, Jasmine had become a living symbol that someone could speak up and be heard, not because they had wealth, but because they had the truth. For Jasmine, a new kind of power, Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for the spotlight, but she understood what it meant when it found her. Her office became flooded with letters, not from lobbyists or corporate interests, but from janitors, grandmothers, students, and former soldiers. One letter simply read, "I don't trust many in D.C., but you made me feel seen." And that was the whole point. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, she wasn't the most senior, but she became something rare. A politician who didn't just speak for people, she spoke with them, and they spoke back. This wasn't just a story about a Senate floor exchange. It was a story about what happens when someone refuses to let silence protect a lie. It was about Jasmine Crockett, once a freshman voice underestimated in backroom deals, choosing to confront not just a senator, but a system, with truth, with dignity, with facts so sharp they left no space for spin. And it was about what followed, a nation forced to see the people it had ignored. Veterans remembered, mothers respected, communities finally called by their names, not stereotypes. Hawley used old rhetoric to defend a broken narrative. Jasmine used one sentence to break it open. You don't get to label our pain as policy failure when you have never survived it. That moment wasn't designed for viral glory. It was built from years of carrying invisible burdens, of watching people suffer while politicians polish speeches, knowing that policy without humanity is just paperwork. This story is a dramatized and fictionalized account meant to reflect real struggles in modern America. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. Now, before you go, take a breath. And if this story moved you, don't let it end here. Tap like to help stories like this reach those who need to hear them. Subscribe if you want more narratives that challenge power without chasing spectacle. Leave a comment below. Tell us which moment hit you hardest for you. And share this with someone who still believes the quietest people often carry the deepest truths. Because maybe the next Jasmine Crockett isn't in office yet. Maybe she's just waiting for a sign that her voice matters. Maybe she's watching now, and if she is, we hear you, we see you, and we're not looking away.